Thank you very much indeed, everyone. With us people from so many different backgrounds and so many different issues, we've already heard some phenomenal experience of working in so-called squatter settlements, for example, which I have no direct experience of, and amazing as it is, and so challenging. I figured out I'd try to talk about something that I think is fundamental to the whole notion of place, but some might perceive it as being relatively narrow. I don't know. I think it's fundamental. And of course, we have such a richness of presentations anyway that I'm sure what I miss will be more than adequately covered, as we've already seen by others. But the title here, Macro, Meso, Micro, is because of how I believe, certainly, that so much that happens at a micro level, if it's not correct at a macro level, will not operate at a micro level. I know it works in the other direction just as much, but the point I want to try and illustrate today is that. If I can quote from the fabulous Jacqueline Robertson, such is the residue of modern design in a culture that does not provide a larger and governing vision in which to fit all the objects it produces. A culture gripped by a devastating schizophrenia that finds no mediation between specific things and their real or implied framework. We make very few successful places, only things. And I'm living in London right now. My God, are we producing things. Things up the wazoo. And you can see some of them here. Here's a thing, and here's another thing, and here's another thing. This particular thing is in Malmo. This other thing is in Birmingham. It's an award winner. Why are you not surprised? But as the great Doug Kelbo said, art first, architecture second, and urbanism third. Some argue that he never said this. Some argue that, of course, he did. But cafes and bars will no longer be the fungus that eats up the pavements of Paris. There you go. But Stanford Anderson, who edited On Streets, a book in the late 1970s that some of you may be aware of, he said, today, whatever our disappointments and fears in the use of streets, our strongest sense for most modern environments is of lost amenity and of fear so pervasive as to enforce total withdrawal from large parks and superblocks of single-use buildings in open space. And I'm always amazed at the examples that were built in the 60s and so on in London, that even on a nice day, which is very rare in London, there are a few people there, but relatively speaking to the streets and squares, they remain empty. They are so empty. Doesn't mean that there aren't a few people having fun and a few people having picnics, but human beings per square foot, they are pretty empty, unless they're major parks. So what the hell are they for? And, of course, our environment needs both a spatial structure that facilitates transactions and orientation, but also concrete objects of identification. And there are none here. And as we see in a lot of so-called landscape urbanism that pervades us at the moment, this on the top is a project in West London that to this day I don't know what it is. I haven't a clue. I think it might be a design for a tea towel, but I fear that it's actually a proposition for a piece of urbanism. And in poor, suffering Christchurch in New Zealand, at the bottom, you can see the ring of things that they're putting around the edge as they try to reconstruct the center. And as a sociologist, Anthony Giddens, pointed out, that this particular period of modernity, because modernity is always with us, isn't it? It's always now, and therefore the whole idea that we, in order to cope with modernity, we have to have 1 foot forward, because that's being modern, but 1 foot anchored back in order to handle the confidence of going forward. And that just applies, just to my mind, to the built environment as much as it does of anything else. We're under extreme dynamism right now. A runaway world, a pace of social change and the scope of social change, and a profoundness that affects pre-existing social practices and modes of behavior. It's a massive issue right now. And every culture has some form of standardized spatial markers which designate a special awareness of place. And in what we might call the current modernity, I suppose, pre-modern settings, if you like, time and space were connected through the situatedness of place, but not really very much anymore. The sort of the when markers, as Giddens points out, were connected not just to the where of social conduct, but to the substance of that conduct itself. Years ago, I wrote with others at Oxford Joint Centre for Urban Design a book. This is not an advert. Please don't buy it. It's out of date. It needs completely rewriting, and therefore do something else with your 20-some pounds. But the introduction still holds true, I believe. The tragedy of modern design, it seems to us, the authors, is that designers never made a concerted effort to work out the form implications of their social and political ideals. Indeed, the very strength of their commitment to these ideals seems to have led designers to feel that a concentration on form itself was somehow superficial. Form, they felt, ought to be the byproduct of progressive social and political attitudes. But in adopting this stance, paradoxically enough, designers failed to realize that the man-made environment is a political system in its own right. Regardless of the political system that brings it about, and there's no clearer example. We know there are some fantastically democratic political systems that have produced undemocratic built environments. And equally so, there are some very despotic political regimes that produced extremely democratic physical environments. So one has to realize that the built environment is a political system in its own right. And so, hence we go on. Try walking through a wall, and you'll notice that it's the physical fabric as well as the way it's managed that sets constraints on what you can and can't do. So multiply that to the scale of a building, or crucially a city, and this is indeed a political matter. And what better example do we have here? I suppose these are both built as homes for working people, but unless the built environment facilitates your ability to transact, then you can't transact. You have to work so hard to transact. And we build settlements for transaction. That is why we build them, whether they're villages, they're cities, they're neighborhoods, they're transactions. That's why we do it. We don't really do it for a fat lot else. We're a social species, and transactions are the basis of settlements. It was interesting in the year 2000, the millennium, that a lot of smaller communities in West Sussex decided that what they would do would actually produce a parish map. These things that people used to produce a long, long time ago, a parish map, and they produced their own parish maps. Things, they were done in a charming, naive way, but very honest way by everyday people. And it was fascinating to see the fact that they did it, and the millennium was significant as well. And again, Anthony Giddens pointed out this whole issue about extremes of globalizing issues on the one hand and personal dispositions on the other, and why people felt the need, the desire to bed themselves in something that they understood as we turned the year 2000. A vast new century, not really knowing what the hell it was going to do, what it was going to bring, and all the rest of it. So they felt the need to anchor back, which is what ontological security, as Anthony Giddens, a sociologist, describes it, a sense of continuity in order and events. It's remarkably important to us to do that, it seems. To most people to do that, not necessarily to people who've attended schools of architecture. And unless our ambition is to be a low-wage developing nation, high urban amenity is a basic. This is something that came out of a study in Australia a good number of years ago. And look where we are in many respects, because I think some of you, certainly our friends here from the USA, in 2010, for the first time in US history, the number of poor living in the suburbs exceeded those living in the cities, which is a phenomenal statistic if you think about it for a second. So as well as the terrific work being done in the barrios and settlements by the two guys here, we have a similar kind of problem in the suburbs of our American American cities? What are the supports? What are the things that are going to... And, you know, there's a book here by a good friend of mine, works with Andres and Liz Galina, produced a Spro repair manual, and several people have said to me, well, it's just full of wishful thinking and fantastic diagrams. Well, let me tell you that what is necessary to be done to many of the suburbs to make them livable again, to make them humane again, to make them interactive and allow transactions again, are actually well illustrated in that book. There's a hell of a lot to be done in our suburbs as well as our cities, and that's going to grow. So why do we build at all? This is a quote from David Engwich, an extraordinary weird guy, bless him, in Australia. He wrote a book called Towards an Eco-City, and I wish this quote had been mine. I find it amazing. Neighborhoods, towns, and cities were invented to facilitate exchange. Exchange of information, friendship, material goods, culture, insight, skills, and also the exchange of emotional, psychological, and spiritual support. What a wonderful way to talk up urbanism. It's so hard to talk up urbanism. It's not for us, because we love it. But for so many people, streets are bad, and towns are bad, and cities are bad. A wonderful, wonderful, positive pronouncement on urbanism. So for a truly sustainable environment, we must maximize the exchange while minimizing the travel necessary to do it. And so what do we do? Let's take a look at the death of the boulevard. Extraordinary. It was deemed old-fashioned, inadequate, and unsafe. The contemporary mantra was, and still is, the higher the movement function, the lower the access function. And we know that happens in so many parts of our cities. The higher the movement function, the lower the access function. Of course, in cities that maximize exchange while minimizing the travel necessary to do it, they do exactly the opposite. You have the maximum movement function with the maximum access function. But of course, that brings all sorts of issues about health and safety, about danger, about conflict, and so on and so on. So, great boulevards, and we still manage to see some of them, thank goodness, had a high movement function and a high access function together. So local and global came together in one space, which is why they were so phenomenal, so interactive, so resilient, and so remarkable. And they're now, are they not, when we try to do them, pretty much excluded from the language of urban thoroughfares today. They're so difficult to do because people will give you 1,000 reasons why it's dangerous, why conflicts will happen, because of the potential for conflicts. Doesn't mean that the conflicts actually happen. When you talk to health and safety people, as I'm sure you all know, they don't actually tell you the amount of conflicts, they tell you the likelihood of a conflict might happen, which is completely different from a conflict actually happening, right? It presumes that we've no intelligence, for a start. So it's always the likelihood of conflict rather than the presence of conflict. And as Alan Jacobs in this great work pointed out on many occasions, that the accident statistics in something like this, which of course, whenever you go to a Parisian boulevard or somewhere in a city like this with a situation like that, there's blood everywhere, deaths every 5 minutes, ambulances and hospitals non-stop. In fact, the accidents are less than the modern highway equivalent that's replaced it. So when local and global meet, they reinforce and feed each other. That's the essence of civilization and civility. That's why I have high streets. That's why you go through a town, through the middle, and people come at it like ribs on a spine. That is where civility takes place. It's where global and local movement meet, is the essence of civility. It's the essence of civic behavior. And if we separate those two, there's no point having a city, and there's no public place. Now, we are getting a little better. But most successful local places are punctuations on global networks, most of them, but at a complex and sophisticated series of different scales. And that's what I'm going to try and quickly illustrate. I'm aware of the time and everything else. So we are getting better, aren't we, in the sense that here in London, on Kensington High Street, we made it safer by the counterintuitive removal of all the things that were supposed to make it safe. Right? So we made it safer by making it more dangerous, theoretically. It was counterintuitive. And we need to be counterintuitive about almost every aspect of place. Not just this. This is starting to be successful, and you see people here. Now, what has happened here, and hence the title of my little contribution, is that Macro and Meso in London were already working quite well. It was a major integrator. It was going through the city, things connected to it, but at the micro level, it was failing. So Micro and Meso, it needed the macro to sort it out. Sometimes the macro needs the Meso to sort it out. Sometimes the Meso needs the micro and the macro to sort it out. And it seems to me that what we need to understand is the relationship between at least those three scales as we make place at a level of detail. And it varies quite a lot, but it's got around 25,000 vehicles a day on here, and roughly 37,000 as you get to one end of it, where the street improvements are undertaken. A 60% reduction in pedestrian accidents and so on. But the local councillors had the devil of a job in terms of personal liability and all sorts of liability in case anything happened. And it was almost impossible for them to do it because of the pressure on them as a council in terms of their personal liability should there be one accident. And this is what we face in so many things in the public realm. And yet, as I think Aristotle said, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is not an act, but a habit. So what have we repeatedly done for generations? Cross-culturally too, I would suggest, but with obviously incredible cultural nuances. But a concrete term for environment, because this word placemaking, I've sort of struggled with it for years, and yet I'm totally sympathetic and empathetic towards it, but I'm still struggling to know what the hell it actually means. But we're all on that kind of search. We all sort of know, but it's very hard to describe. But at least a concrete term for environment, I suppose, is place. It's common usage to say that acts and occurrences take place. They take place. This meeting is taking place in this wonderful lecture theatre. We've come in and we've taken it. It takes place. The market will take place in the square, and so on and so on. So that's that gives us an idea. And you can make place, and the work of several people who are going to present here is, we know is phenomenal with local people, projects for public spaces and others. But you can also take place made by somebody else, if it allows you and invites you to do so. Some of the greatest participatory places were not built by those who currently enjoy them, but they've enjoyed them for centuries. So there's something about them, whoever built them, that makes them successful. So going back to, if I may, to Aristotle briefly, excellence is not an act, but a habit. What is it that we seem to have done quite often? And I always love going back, as I'm sure many of you do, looking at historical maps of places and how they grew and how they evolved. And they are remarkably similar. And that always fascinates me. And these are examples, obviously, from Britain. But you go to examples in other countries and other cultures. And even though there are obviously subtle differences, there are differences of climate and so on and so on. But there's a remarkable similarity between how we structure our world at a fundamental level, with all sorts of cultural layers put on top. And so I work a lot with a group of people that some of you know about called Space Syntax. And I've come to work with them a great deal, and I've come to challenge and be challenged by them and so on and so on. But one thing that has fascinated me, and their work is across cultures and countries. I'm going to show you examples primarily in the UK, but I would urge you to consider the similarities between this and other places that they indeed work. You'll find a remarkable similarity between these diagrams, and I'll explain these diagrams, I know some of you know, in a few minutes' time. But you look at how these places grew, and they seem to be all structured pretty much the same. Now, they're all original settlements across Britain, but as far as I know, when these things were being created and formed, they were not emailing each other. They were not sending each other pictures saying, look at what we're doing, how are you getting on? Right? They were all doing this at separate stages, separate from each other completely. It took 4 or 5, 6, 7 days to get from one to the other, and who the hell cared anyway? Yet they're remarkably similar in terms of those colors, and we'll look at that in a little while. Because it seems so much of what is shown here And what is shown here, if I might be allowed to describe it, is what you might call a deformed wheel. It's like a cycle wheel, but it's sort of a little bit bent to do with all sorts of little bits of topography and ownership and so on and so on. But it's basically a deformed wheel. All those things are deformed wheels. And we tend to, whenever things happen which are called either organic or unplanned for some bizarre reason, things that are called unplanned are usually the only things that are planned sensibly. But unplanned, it's amazing how they are like deformed wheels. Across cultures, I find quite extraordinary. And of course, it continues into the city where local things meet global things and something is cemented. Something is put down. Local meets global and there's a pause. There's a pause for interaction. And I would suggest, if you go back to looking at your neighborhoods, your traditions, you'll find that exactly same process, for the most part, is operating. And that's called making place and taking place. Clearly, we have some cities, way back from Miletus and all sorts of other places, and indeed, the extraordinary Manhattan. And they're basically orthogonal grids for the most part. And the orthogonal grid fascinates me because I love New York and I love so many other places that have components of orthogonal grids. This city does, London does. But the whole idea of a city being an orthogonal grid, I think, obviously helps enormously in terms of interaction and transaction, because if it's a fine grain of blocks, then there's a lot of permeability. But there's only kind of permeability, as it were, 4 directions. And so if ever you're trying to do that, there's an enormous disruption in actual movement, unless you tend, as people do when the city is not planned by commissioners. And of course, Lower Manhattan, before the commissioners did their stuff, I think in 1830, whatever it was much more of a deformed grid. It was much more of a series of, if you like, deformed wheels. And clearly, again, you can get fabulous little windfall things like Paley Park, which is a wonderful urban space, brilliantly conceived, with a fabulous sort of prospect refuge balance, which is essential in dense urban spaces where you sort of sit on the edge of the space and you can retreat into it or you can go out into the public realm. That's a fundamental of all great urban spaces, is what some people call a prospect refuge balance. But when you look down at the bottom end of Lower Manhattan, and here around the Village and every other places, you see again natural things in the earlier stages before the commissioners took hold of things further up, an incredibly complex series of deformed wheels laid on each other at different levels. And I think that the crooked streets of Lower Manhattan remind us really that the orthogonal grid was not to me the natural or preordained condition of the city. That doesn't mean there aren't great examples of it, but it was far more sophisticated, not disorganized, but actually far more sophisticated degrees of variety and interaction as a result of greater variety in spatial integration. It's effectively what Jane Jacobs said when she talked about things as rather than things being chaotic or unplanned, they're actually organized complexity, and they're perfectly and totally rational in what they do. But what has happened, of course, in Manhattan recently is, of course, well, not recently, but Broadway, which, as we know, was the old Indian Trail that cut right across. And I'm fascinated. Some people here may be able to tell me why the commissioners respected Broadway rather than cut all the way, abandoned it and cut it out. Maybe it was legal or something, I don't know. But what it actually produced. And of course, Broadway is the most integrated street in Manhattan because it cuts through and it crosses so many more other streets than any other street does. So it's the most integrated street in the whole of Manhattan. And lo and behold, it's the history of parades are on Broadway, the celebrating of the Erie Canal, they rolled up Broadway. In 1829, I'm led to believe, I wasn't there, but 12,000 scholars marched along Broadway to celebrate the mighty machinery of Sunday schools. President Andrew Jackson sort of tripped the light fantastic up there in 1833. Why? Because it's the most integrated street in New York City. It connects to most streets that connect to most streets in the most direct and axial way. Therefore, it has most of the significant public places along it, as well because of the configuration of the grid. And so we know now that it has so many fantastic places along it, and the Flatiron Building, the response, the whole way of signposting and signing the city as a result of Broadway is absolutely fantastic. And I know that with Fred and Ethan and Kathy and the guys, that so many people, and the lady, I forget her name, who's in charge of the Department of Transportation, have done some amazing things where Broadway crosses the grid in recent times. So they've balanced the macro, the meso, and the micro. Before, the macro was so powerful, and the meso, because of lots of streets going into it, but the micro was failing. And they've started to put a balance between macro, meso, and micro into Manhattan. In London, which of course is a very, very complex and sophisticated grid, where a lot of our places, one block deep. If you go to London, you go one block deep. It's extraordinary, and one of the reasons why you go one block deep in London, they're very, very axial. The streets are very, very busy. They were never laid out as massive boulevards like they were in later times in Paris. They are busy. They've got fabulous, vibrant life, but they're not exactly places of relaxation and peace. But they're fantastic places. So the deformed grid takes you with very slight axial changes to one block deep. And there, you go inside there, which is Shepherd Market. For those of you who may know that, you go one block deep up from Piccadilly, and you get into Covent Garden. It's one block deep. You've got so many places that are one block deep in London, but very axially connected. And that's often because they bypassed London was a mixture of very, very small villages, I'm sure, that were ultimately amalgamated into the city. And the remnants of them create extraordinary places where you can go from being unbelievably busy to being as quiet as a mouse, one block deep with one axial change. And it happens time after time after time after time. And the thing that's amazing about this is that it's now, I believe, becoming capable of prediction, of analysis and prediction, to help us decide what kind of places are likely to exist where. And we've never really been able to do that. We've done it intuitively and got it halfway right, and you know that's fine, because we're all urbanists and we study the city and we learn and so on and so on. But when I look at, for example, at Bologna, again, the deformed wheel. And out to my mind, the plan of Bologna is quite one of the finest town plans I know, because you can come in from the countryside, you can see all these things go out beyond the different scales of wall, and they go out into the countryside. So there's a deformed wheel right across the countryside. It then comes into the town and gets other levels of deformed wheel. You get the radii going straight to the end of the main street. You've got the Roman crossroads in the middle. You know, that town cannot fail as a result of the configuration of the grid. You have to work so damned hard to make Bologna fail, because the grid is so interactive, so responsive, and so supportive of human transactions. And so at the macro level, you go right out here. It's hard to see, but if you trace, it's very hard to see on this, isn't it? In fact, a complete waste of time. But if you look, you'll find that the radial's coming in the macro right into here, but look at all the gubbins around the outside that's almost masted. All the structural stuff that has grown around Bologna and lost that. But if you can see through that, you see the macro at that level, the meso at that level, and the micro at that level. A phenomenal series of macro, meso, micro relationships that make this scale of public space at the end. Still has to be formed, still has to be there. You still need the colonnades, you still need the shelter, you still need the rules, you still need all the work that a lot of people do at public space level. But it's the relationships across the piece that are fundamental to the success of the micro as well. Greve, a place that I suspect, I hope some of you know, it comes in and clearly it's affected by its topography. It's in a valley, but look, you come up the valley, down the tributary valley, down the tributary valley, and wallop. There's a space. There's a space where the global comes down the valleys. As soon as the global meets, you stop. And transactions take place, and life takes place, commerce takes place, culture takes place, as a result of it. And it is a phenomenal, phenomenal space in terms of the edge conditions, the amount of activity settings that are possible here to support activity patterns. The whole thing is utterly extraordinary. And how do I go straight to an American town having said that? Well, you know, I go to Saratoga Springs that I know very, very well because my wife comes from the appalling Clifton Park suburban sprawl in upstate New York, and I escape to Saratoga Springs every morning, if I possibly can, to convince myself that Americans are still sane. And the thing, and they are, surprisingly enough, they are. And Saratoga Springs is exactly the same. If you look at Saratoga Springs from way out on Google Earth, the things come in from the countryside around. At the meso level, they come in from the side streets, and the thing goes straight down the throat of it. And lo and behold, everything in America is working against this place. Absolutely everything. There's nothing working for it at all, and yet it survives. It survives despite being in the USA. So macro, meso, and micro are in unison here. And it's the fact that macro, meso, and micro are in unison is helping it hang on by the skin of its teeth. But the fact that all those layers are together means that some guy can sit here, and there's 6 lanes of traffic going through it, I think. Guys, 6 lanes of traffic, I think, and 2 parking lanes, something like that. And a guy can sit here with a piece of wood carving out a wooden horse. And at one level, that's brilliant because it's a wide sidewalk, but at another level, it's because of the whole layers that just pulls people in to the transaction that then takes place at the next level down. Andres said once, I think, I'm quoting him right, people visit towns in America, people visit towns purely because they're towns. Extraordinary. But but when you look at, and this could be France, it could be any kind of place, but it happens to be England. But look at the triangulation that takes place, even at this scale. This is a piece of landscape that's grown as a result of human interaction over centuries. And if you look at it, it is deformed wheels at every conceivable scale. They're all different because the settlements are different. Some are small, some are, but if you look at it, it's an extraordinary piece of natural movement. Movement and rest, travel and transaction, path and node, thoroughfares and centers. Call it what you will. But so much place advantage stems from infrastructure that supports or indeed creates its attractions. So the constant triangulation. And you go to London where everybody, you know, because, for heaven's sake, we walk in straight lines, don't we? I mean, we might occasionally deviate, and particularly going home from the pub, we might wobble a little, but primarily we walk in straight lines. That's what we want to do. And we hope that they're all beautiful, but if they aren't, we might make a more beautiful choice. But in essence, we choose to walk in straight lines, and that's why there's so much of the radial nature in natural places. And when you take London, you'll see that again, I suppose, this is a space syntax drawing of London. But you'll notice, again, look at the amount and the layers of deformed wheels that exist in that place. And that's one reason why London is a most fantastic, vibrant city that has things at the citywide level for everyone. It has things at the meso level in neighborhoods. It has things at the local level. It has them layered 1 block deep. It has them layered in all sorts of ways. So the range of places is as a result of a lot of detailed work, but it's also a result of the actual configuration of the grid itself as the generator of these places that give you the complexity and the range in order to make a complex range of spaces. And if I can paraphrase from Professor Hillier, urbanity, we suggest, is not so mysterious. Good space is used space. Most urban space is movement. Most movement is through movement. That is the byproduct of how the grid offers routes from everywhere to everywhere else. Most informal space use is also movement related. In other words, you're on your way somewhere. You're either going to a place or you're on your way to it. And sometimes when you're on your way to it, you discover a new place, and it becomes a place that you stop and go back to the next time. It happens all the time, but only in cities that let you do it. It doesn't happen in cities that don't let you do it. And so land uses and building density follow movement in the grid. They do. Both adapting to and multiplying its effects in natural urbanism I'm talking about. Again, to carry on the quote, the urban buzz or lack of it when it suits us. Lack of it when it suits us. So it doesn't mean that everything's busy. It means that some places are incredibly quiet, and so they should be. Nobody's trying to make everything busy. It's just as great to have a busy place as a quiet place. The word place is still in there as far as I can see. So the urban buzz, or lack of it when it suits us, is the combination of these. And the fundamental determinant is the structure of the grid itself. The urban grid, through its influence on the movement economy, is the fundamental source of multifunctionality that gives life to cities. And this is something that I think that urbanism tends to forget. So when you look, for example, and it's now with space syntax, I use it in projects, I'll try and show a couple if I've time, that if you look at this sort of computer-generated model, which calculates the likelihood that any street segment is going to be chosen on routes between all origins and all destinations. It's the degree of connectivity, the degree of integration. And if you look at these streets in London globally, the ones that glow red are the ones that are operating globally. They're all operating globally on here. The ones that glow red are the ones that are most connected to most streets and connected to most streets. So they're most integrated. And as you go down to the colder colors of blue and green, they're the ones that are least connected globally in London. Now that therefore means you can start to say, well, I'm not likely to put a department store or a so-and-so on one of those streets, but I might well put this on one of those streets because, and so on. But when you take the same diagram and you're actually on the same part of London and I can find my pointer, and you look at it locally, you'll see the colors change. There. It goes a lot warmer. And that's because what the computer has now done is defined how those streets work just 800 meters away from each other. And what that kind of tells you, therefore, is that some of these streets are much, much more important up to about 800 meters away, and they become less and less important in the structure as you go further and further away. So in other words, their importance is relative to how far away you are from them. Now, if you look at that and think, well, that is, and so therefore you could define it for 600 meters, you could define it for 200 meters, you could define it for these things will change. Some things will stay red all the time, and if they stay red all the time, it means they're pretty damned important across the city at whatever scale you're at. So you know what? It's going to be on those things, your bigger department stores, your higher land values in commercial terms, and so on and so on. And so you get to a place like this, Seven Dials in London, which to me is one of the most fantastic urban spaces that I know in London. Look what people will do there, sitting there. You can look down 7 streets from this monument. It's very tight, it's very intimate. There you see it in plan. I don't know how many of you know it, 7 Dials. But you look at its accessibility globally, and you see that going straight through the middle of it is a rather important street. You wouldn't know it by just looking at the plan. But it's actually a rather important street, even in London globally. Even though it goes 1 block deep, it's slightly anomalous. And as a result of that, there's so many things have happened there. So many things have happened. Pubs on every corner, there's all sorts of things. You look at it locally, and it still glows pretty well. So not surprisingly, spaces receive their being as much more from locations as they do from space itself. And when places are classified, what terms do we use, or should we use? We use promontory, green, square, street, plaza, grove, courtyard. Space is more prepositions, isn't it? It's like over, under, behind. And character is adjectives like large, dark, dangerous, intimate, and so on. So when I look at landscape urbanism, I haven't a clue what word to use for the space that is in there. I don't have a noun. Well, I have sort of stuff, I suppose. So when I look at Marylebone High Street, again here, a fantastic street. It's not Oxford Street, it's just one axial move off Oxford Street. Let's look at what it does on the computer. It glows very red, much redder than all the others that are straighter. You see, these are coming from Oxford Street up to Euston Road and Regent's Park, but this one is more integrated, and one reason why it's more integrated is because there's a few axial changes, a few things that link more directly to it. So there you are, but only at 1,250 meters. If you go to 1,500 meters or 1,800 meters, it doesn't glow red anymore. In other words, it's significant at that kind of scale, more or less. And therefore, it has those kind of things on it. It doesn't have the bigger stuff on it. It has stuff on it that is more appropriate to that position in the fabric of the grid. There are many examples. Lamb's Conduit Street is another very well integrated street, but at a lesser level. It's red only at 250 meters. That's all. It's red at 250 meters. So that means it's a great little street, but it's only a great local little street. So if we're designing, now imagine doing this when you're designing something rather than when you're analyzing something. You can start to be reasonably sure with the amount of work that's been done behind this computer-generated model across urbanism in so many countries and cultures, is that you've got more than a fighting chance of getting it halfway right, even before it's built. Because you can test it and say, well, you know, look at that configuration. It's very similar to this, and this. Clearly, there are local cultural issues that all have to be factored in, of course. So then you go to Lamb's Conduit Street, and that's a street that is appropriate in what's going on there to its position in the fabric. I think a final one. But one place, this is the Lloyd's office tower. So we're right in the city of London. The Gherkin is just up here, bless it. And but this is Leadenhall Market. Some of you may be aware of Leadenhall Market. I don't know. But if you look at Leadenhall Market in the city of London, and you think it's all incredible, but put the computer on to measure its spatial integration, and lo and behold, at 250 meters only, granted, it's the most integrated little cluster in that area. Lo and behold, there's a market there. And as it happens, the Romans put it there. And that was the center of Roman London. They didn't put the market there, but the market came there in the 14th century. And it survived enormously. And one of the reasons why it survives and is so popular is, of course, it's incredibly beautiful. But it's also because of where it is. Now, you put Leadenhall Market even 200 meters away in a slightly different place, and it could still be as beautiful, but it will not do as well. It will not get as much local and global passing trade as a result of its spatial location. So on a couple of projects that I've worked on, this is, yeah, just about all right. This was a 20,000, should I say, a 60,000 population extension to a British new town I worked on some time ago with space syntax. And you can see the way we designed it and planned it, looking at all sorts of issues of topography and everything else. But again, maybe you say, oh, this is becoming a little too formulaic for me, but you'll find that the town is a series of deformed wheels at different scales, integrating paths and movement and centers and slight axial changes between the major ones, more axial changes in the minor ones, and so on and so on. But when we looked at it with space syntax at the overall city, we looked at the ones that were most spatially integrated streets. And they're the ones where the town centre would logically be. Of course, this is a British new town, so the town centre's nowhere near where it would logically be if human beings had done it, right? Instead of people who've gone through planning for 3 or 4 years and been turned into some kind of nerd. So if you look at these things, these are exactly where the main streets, the most global, town-wide enterprise would be. What are they? They're no-frontage highways. So straight away, the local commerce has been taken away, not by economics, but by planning and highways. It's been taken away from the place it wants to be. So you've lost places straight away just by that very act. And then you wonder why local centres don't work, because it puts them in the middle where there's no spatial interaction, and they die. They just die, because there isn't enough global-local integration. But when we looked at it, we and we're manipulating this all the time, because one thing you can do, you can shift it all the time and test and see if other things glow red, other things glow different colors. And we put a new connection across the river, and all of a sudden, that not surprisingly came red, and that gave us reasonable confidence to say that in that particular part of the town, with the amount of connectivity we've got, we were reasonably confident we could start designing and arguing for things at a local high street level. The final example I've got of the whole business of macro, meso, and micro working together was a project I worked on in South Africa for some years. A while back. It's called Melrose Arch. It's in suburban South Africa, so it's suburbanizing the sprawl that is South Africa north of the center of Johannesburg, no question. But this was done about a couple of years after Nelson Mandela came into power. And the Gold Mines Pension Fund, we talked long and hard with them about the idea of doing something, because all around here it's internal shopping malls, highly and gated communities. It's just diabolical for those of you who know it or don't know it. And the idea of breaking through all that again, particularly 2 years after President Nelson Mandela had come into power, to cut a very long story short, it was going to be an internal shopping mall, massive, with office towers on top. We persuaded, along with some great people in South Africa, the idea that they should turn it into a very well-connected, integrated piece of traditional urbanism, fine-grained, with looking at the space syntax diagrams about how we could connect through and how we could integrate it, and so on. And as a result, this is it. And remember, it was going to be an internal, gated, highly fortified shopping, internal retail development, and this is what it has become as a result. So, and in May 2011, it was sold for 1.27 billion rand. I'm told it is now valued at 4.5 to 5 billion rand. So, place can also make money, but you've got to get the right place in the grid. Thank you very much.